sort of slow and steady approach, what I've done is I've taken into account this idea of protein to energy ratio, right? And I've increased protein and I've decreased fat to a point where for me, I'm comfortable. I'm not angsty because I'm too low fat, but I'm not giving my body any opportunity to turn surplus energy into fat cells.
We all should know by now how important it is to get in enough protein. I talk about this all the time. An excellent way to add in some additional animal-based protein with a full amino acid profile is with Equip Prime Protein. This is the one I love. This is the one I recommend. Every scoop has 4 ounces of super collagenous grass-fed beef. Use the code Carnitarian and you'll get 15% off your first order over at Equip Food.
I am not a qualified lipedema expert, but I have lived with it for quite some time. It runs in my family. My sister deals with it, and I deal with it. So basically, lipedema is an adipofascial disease, and it involves the adipose tissue, your fat tissue, and it involves the fascia, which would normally sort of surround the muscle and fat layers and be between them. But in lipedema, the fascia sort of becomes fibrotic and entangled with the fat and even with the muscle. And so with lipedema, that fat is so differently functioning than normal fat. And so people need to understand that it's not just an odd distribution. Some people think, well, if you've got a slim torso and you've got pear shape, you've got lipedema. And that's not it. Like that's not the extent. It goes way beyond that. So you may have that pear shape, but what's happening behind that and underneath the skin is all of this sort of fat dysfunction. And because it's dysfunctional fat, like I was reading a paper that there are 4,400 differences in the fat tissue that you can call out between normal adipose tissue and lipedema fat tissue. The signaling is different. It has a tendency to not release its fat stores in a way that normal fat would. There's angiogenesis there, the way that, normally we're familiar with that word in cancer cells where they create their own lymphatic system and their own blood system to feed the cancer cells. Lipedema fat cells have a sort of a similar genesis of like pathways that run between them. And it's this sort of tangled mess that it doesn't respond to diet and exercise the way normal fat does. It's just dysfunctional fat. And so the frustration that comes from the women, and it's like 1 in 10, it's a lot of women have this condition, and they're often dismissed by their doctors, and the doctors say, well, you just need to lose some weight. The frustration is in 2 parts. Like, first of all, there's pain, there's mobility issues, there's physical issues that come along with this fat. And so you'll see bruising in these women, and they'll say, I don't know how I got these bruises, or it will be their legs or the backs of their arms will be very sensitive to touch. So you'll put a blood pressure cuff on one of these women and they'll scream, and the doctor will be like, oh, stop being such a big baby. It's just a blood pressure cuff. But there's pain involved there that the doctor can't understand. And it's real. There's so much sensitivity. I remember, if you walk in a house and someone's dog jumps on your thighs to say hi, that is excruciating. And it is so painful, like you want to scream, because it feels like you're being hit with like a crowbar. It doesn't feel like a sweet little dog. It's really painful. Basically, what I'm dealing with and how I'm helping myself with that is in controlling the inflammation and the amount of fat cells that I create. So like in regular people, you would have a set amount of fat cells, and if you overeat, you stuff those fat cells, and you may end up like a type 2 diabetic because your fat cells are sort of large and they become, insensitive to insulin, and you get these symptoms of type 2 diabetes. In women with lipedema, they have different differentiation of the stem cells in their fat tissue, And they keep creating from those stem cells more fat cells. And so instead of a situation where if you overeat, you plump up your existing fat cells, we're in a situation where if we overeat, we gain more fat cells. And that will just keep on going. But because of the dysregulated signaling happening from those fat cells become unable to release their fat stores. And so losing weight becomes very hard. And there's this sort of vicious cycle of just growth. And that's why they say lipedema can only be resolved with liposuction, because according to the literature, there is no cure for this. There's only mitigation of symptoms, and conservative measures like compression, cold therapy, manual lymphatic drainage, MLD. These are things that can help with being more comfortable, but they typically don't claim to help with size reduction. In my sort of slow and steady approach, what I've done is I've taken into account this idea of protein to energy ratio, right? And I've increased protein and I've decreased fat to a point where for me, I'm comfortable. I'm not angsty because I'm too low fat, but I'm not giving my body any opportunity to turn surplus energy into fat cells or to stuff my fat cells. It's a really fine line that I walk, but I find it very easy to do if I just focus on higher protein foods, because I'm just always erring on the side of too much protein versus too much fat. But keeping calories in check, which is something carnivores don't like to talk about. They say, calories don't matter. But for us, for lipedema, it really does matter. I've been able to lose leg fat, reduce my body fat percentage, even in the legs, which I never thought would be possible. I had thought for sure that ultimately I'm going to end up on the liposuction table because that's the path. That's the path. And now it's becoming available under some insurance companies. And so there's a really strong push towards, go get the liposuction and you can get it covered. And it helps so many women. And these women's stories are, I felt terrible. I could hardly move. I was in a wheelchair to now I can move. And so the liposuction solution is fantastic. I'm not a huge fan of surgery. And so I have always said, well, I'm going to just try as hard as I can to stay away from the liposuction. And I think if I keep going with the way I'm going, I won't need to do it. I've been able to reduce my fat instead of having it progress. But even just being able to maintain fat levels in lipedema legs is a really, really hard thing to do. My heart goes out to these women, and I talk with them all the time, especially now more than ever, and I try to give them hope that you can do the conservative measures. You don't necessarily have to think I'm just going to get worse. And it's embarrassing. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's sort of this point of pride that women with lipedema get judged. And people say things like, you just need to be a little bit more strict with your diet. The women that I talk to are all chronically under-eating because they are so afraid of, number one, getting bigger, and number two, of the judgment, especially in public. And I see women who I can tell they've got lipedema, and you would never want to walk up to a woman with lipedema and say, hey, by the way, did you, I don't recommend anybody ever do that. But I can see that they've got lipedema, and I look at what they're eating, and it's always something super low calorie, and they are trying really hard because it's embarrassing, and it's something that they've probably been dealing with for a really long time. They've probably tried to get some help, and it's been shut down several times. A lot of doctors don't even believe that it's a real thing. And I'm so happy that there are more doctors talking about it in the last few years, but a lot of doctors in the past have argued against it being even a diagnosis. So finally it's a diagnosis. Finally, it's something that they're saying, you can talk to your doctor about, something that the doctors can bill for. So basically that's what that's all about. It's got a code so they can bill for the appointment. But prior to a few years ago, doctors would not discuss this. They didn't recognize it at all. And so I like to use a higher protein, lower fat carnivore approach, I think has helped me so much. But then there's also the components of like keeping stress low, making sure sleep is great, and things like that have managed it. And so, I'm feeling really good about it. And I hope that I can inspire other women to start feeling like a little bit hopeful that they're not destined to become those stage 4 pictures that they've all seen. Like when you look up lipedema, you see those stage 4 pictures and you think to yourself, this is my future. The doctor will confirm this is how it's going to go. And so hopefully I've seen people, there's one woman online who is just killing it. She had, I think it was stage 3 lipedema, and with like an anti-inflammatory diet, she is killing it. She's gotten the mass of her legs down to such an extent where if you saw her in, leggings, you wouldn't necessarily know that she's got lipedema. Whereas, maybe 5-6 years ago, you'd know for sure, no matter what she was wearing. So I'm hopeful, and I'm just going to keep on my path and hopefully help some other people do the same thing.
I only tend to hear about negative things that come with liposuction. Do you hear any kind of like side effects or downsides to that?
Well, liposuction in general, if it's not done correctly, has all sorts of like side effects like deformities. I've heard of, people just having lots of pain from liposuction that doesn't go away. And also you end up with, a not great looking result. If you have lymphatic issues and you go to a doctor who's not really careful about what they're doing, you can turn lipedema into lymphedema. Because if you mess with your lymphatic pathways while you're doing a liposuction, things get a lot worse. And that's really hard to reverse. Like if you're messing with lymphatics and you end up with scar tissue, lymphedema is really, really difficult. Also, there's this point where people say, and I don't have experience with it, but some people say when you get liposuction in one area, your body tries to get back to its set point and you end up gaining fat in other areas. I haven't had any personal experience with that, obviously, but that's one thing that definitely is in the back of my head.
I've heard that as well, but I've never seen it either. So that's all very interesting. You mentioned a low inflammatory diet. Obviously, a carnivore diet is very low inflammation because you're eliminating everything that could possibly be. But what are some of the other priorities if somebody isn't going to do, super strict carnivore? What things should they be looking out for? Is it mostly just ultra processed foods, or are we talking about, again, things like oxalates and other plant toxins?
So it seems to be the two big heavy hitters are the carbohydrates and the seed oils. And that's just across the board for everything anyway. Like we know that processed foods are super highly inflammatory because of the refined carbohydrate. And seed oils are just super inflammatory and really do contribute to unhealthy fat cells. So, some people will say, I went on an anti-inflammatory diet, and so I cut out bread and candy and fried foods. Like, okay, that's a great idea, but like really what they're doing there is they're cutting out seed oils and they're cutting out processed foods and they're cutting out sugar. And so they're doing like a whole foods diet without saying that they're doing a whole foods diet. I don't know the science about oxalate and lipedema enough to say. I chatted with Sally once and she said there is a correlation between like unhealthy fat cells and oxalate. I don't know. I don't remember enough about it to speak about it. But a carnivore diet to me is really like the best anti-inflammatory diet. So, that I love that. But in reality, I don't think cucumbers are inflammatory, and I don't think, lettuce or avocado is inflammatory. So probably those things can be included, also.